Welcome to HashiConf Digital 2020. So for anyone that was wondering, it turns out that redacted is not actually the name of this session. We obviously didn't want to ruin the surprise of Boundary's announcement and Armon and Mitchell's keynote this morning, so we redacted the title. That said, for anyone that missed today's keynote, Boundary is a new secure access management offering from HashiCorp that's going to enable identity-based access controls for dynamic infrastructure. Today, Jeff Mitchell and I are going to give some context into the customer problems that Boundary will solve, both long-term and for today's open source 0.1 release. We'll also run through a real demo of what it's like to manage and create sessions with Boundary so that you can see how easy it is to manage and monitor access at scale. Lastly, we'd love to share with you where we think the project goes from here and how you can try it out and get involved. With that said, let me introduce myself quickly. My name is Pete Pacent, and I'm the product management lead for Boundary. Joined with me today is Jeff Mitchell, who's the principal engineer of secure products at HashiCorp.
Hi there. Yep, I'm a principal engineer in secure at HashiCorp. I've spent many years working on Vault, and more recently I've been bootstrapping Boundary.
Awesome. Well, with that said, let's talk a little bit about Boundary's origin. Now, as we're all aware, HashiCorp builds automation tools for the various workflows in the application delivery lifecycle. One of the workflows in that delivery lifecycle is that ultimately humans, whether developers or DevOps engineers, are going to need to access their app's infrastructure. When they do, organizations need to ensure that that access is securely monitored and managed. Now, I know what you're thinking. Wait, Pete, this sounds a lot like the Vault pitch, and it really does, because Boundary and Vault are really two sides of the same coin. Vault secures access to infrastructure resources by tightly controlling access to target credentials based on client identity. Boundary takes that value prop a step further by securely monitoring and managing the user sessions that those credentials are used to create. To better understand this, let's quickly revisit the scenario that Armon talked about in today's keynote. Let's consider a typical developer trying to access a production app or to troubleshoot an issue. Now, in a traditional access model, the app's likely deployed to a private network or VPC on a well-known set of virtual IP addresses, and access security is configured at the IP level. This really assumes a world where resource addresses don't change frequently. In fact, they really better not in this model, because to configure any kind of access to the target, I need to go through about 4 or 5 different steps. As a developer, I need to get access to a corporate VPN, and then an SSH bastion host or privileged access management tool that straddles the corporate network and data center network. My traffic is typically passed through some firewall that's enforcing IP-based policies on what has access to this private network and app. On top of this, I may need credentials for each of those steps, plus credentials for the target itself, and those are often exposed to the end user. Now, each one of these steps requires people and time to staff appropriately. And the attack surface areas for breaches in this model are also massive because, among many things, the potential time window for exploits can be long because of the overhead of updating each one of these controls independently. Now, despite all of these hurdles with a lot of overhead, I might be able to manage my app's access in this model if it's deployed in a static environment on a well-known address space. But what if I'm not running my app on that well-known set of addresses? What if I'm a developer at a modern digital company with apps and infrastructure across all of the major cloud platforms, as well as my own on-premises data center? What if I need to scale my infrastructure up and down to meet the availability and performance needs of my application? What if infrastructure is continuously deployed so that the app's resource instances and their network addresses are constantly changing? And what if I want to secure my apps and organization by creating a totally ephemeral access model for connecting to my infrastructure? So the infrastructure itself is provisioned just in time, as are the credentials used to access the target and the session permissions used to connect. That traditional access workflow that we just described requires a lot of manual configuration and overhead when I'm running on a single static app, and it really becomes completely unmanageable when I'm dealing with ephemeral access at modern cloud scale. Now, this model of ephemeral access is really the problem Boundary is designed to solve. With Boundary, access permissions are based on the identity of the user or client rather than their network location or their access to static credentials. Their identity is assigned to a role which gives it access to a set of hosts and services that it can connect to and perform actions on securely, even over lower zero-trust networks. And when I go to connect, the connection configuration to that end target is automated. And when I say that, I really mean the process of discovering new targets as they're deployed is automated, as is the process of applying my roles, policies, and credentials that govern how I can access my target. Now this way, the access policies assigned to that target are applied even as new host instances are provisioned or updated. Our vision for Boundary open source is really to enable this ephemeral model of access, in which users can authenticate to Boundary using their identity of choice, then authorize to perform actions on dynamic sets of targets, and then be granted just-in-time access to connect to those targets via credentials provided by Vault or a credential management solution of choice. With Boundary's open source offering, we really hope to lean into collaborating with partners in the community to build an ecosystem of integrations at each of the touch points in this workflow, whether that's the identity provider you use to authenticate to Boundary, the cloud platform for which we support dynamic host discovery, or the credentials used to access your target. Now, in today's 0.1 open source launch, we're going to focus on three main use cases within secure access management. The first is identity-based access controls for TCP-based sessions. With this, administrators can define a perimeter of resources and identities under management. They can then create roles with granular permissions in terms of what targets their users can access so that you can secure those targets over low or zero trust networks. For end users accessing Boundary resources, you can connect through to your end target with whatever layer 7 protocol you'd want to use to access your resource, whether that's SSH, RDP, Postgres, what have you. Administrators can then automate these access configurations and the discovery of hosts and services as they're provisioned with the use of a Boundary Terraform provider. Now, with this Terraform provider, you can configure the access policies for your infrastructure with the same tool that you use to actually provision it. And outside of Terraform, API-first design is really a core principle of Boundary, and will support configuration through a fully instrumented CLI, REST API, and SDK interfaces. And finally, admins can get the visibility into sessions created with Boundary through session logs that are exposed both through Boundary's administrator UI or via integration with your log analytics or data visualization tool of choice. These session logs also answer questions like what identity accessed what system, when that access occurred, and when it might have been terminated. In terms of how Boundary actually creates and manages these sessions for users, Boundary clusters consist of a control plane and a set of worker nodes. Users connect to Boundary via a set of controllers that serve that actual control plane, and the control plane manages what the user has access to and brokers that user session to a worker node, which then proxies the user session to the target system. Currently, these workers serve as a transparent proxy, but in the future, Boundary workers will support protocol decoding to support things like managing and introspecting session activity. One primary benefit of this model is that by managing access through these worker nodes, we avoid the need for an on-target agent. So you don't need to manage the resource constraints and complexity of adding yet another agent to your infrastructure. With that, I'm going to hand it over to Jeff for a demo of Boundary's UI and command line. He'll show you what it's like to create and manage sessions with Boundary, and then he'll show you how you can configure access at scale with Boundary's Terraform provider. And lastly, I'll show you how monitors can actually monitor and manage those sessions created through Boundary.
So I'm going to show a demo of Boundary here and show a bunch of different things. I'm going to kind of deep dive in real fast, so bear with me. First, I'm going to launch Boundary Dev, like our other tools versus dev mode. And what it's doing right now is it's creating a Postgres container. I'm going to copy that port for use later on. And it's creating a number of resources within the system. And these have a predictable suffix to make it really easy from one instantiation of dev mode to the other to use existing scripts and so on. But you can change that if you want. The next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to authenticate to Boundary so that I can actually make calls against it. After I authenticate, then the token that's created will get stored in the OS system keychain, so it's not stored on disk. It can also be provided through an envar or a flag. So the super easy mode of getting started is that part of the resources that we create in dev mode is we actually create a connection that's suitable for you to connect to your local box on SSH through Boundary. So that's what I'm going to do right now, and I'll explain more about what the targets are in a couple of moments. So you can see I'm now connected, and if you saw the text on the right scroll up, that's because I'm connected through Boundary. I mean that session through there, and we can see that I authorized a connection was established, it's closed. I'm going to connect again so that I can show you what this looks like in the UI. So I'm going to go into this generated org scope. Scopes are basically resources that contain other types of resources. An organization essentially is there to hold kind of IAM infrastructure, so things like auth methods and users, and projects have infrastructure. So I'm going to go into the sessions, and we can see that there's one session there that was terminated. That was the initial session I made. And there's another that's active. I'm going to hit cancel. And we see that that session was closed because it was going through Boundary, and we decided that, you know what, I don't want to allow that session to keep going. And there are other things that will trigger that to happen automatically. So for instance, if you deauthorize a user, if you remove their account from the system, it closes all sessions that are active. We try to make it very kind of easy to say, you know what, I don't want someone to have this session anymore. I want it to go away. So I'm going to show you this target. So there's a target kind of maps between connection information and host sets. Host sets contain one or more hosts that act as equivalent resources for the purposes of connecting. And then we can see in the target, a name and so on, and a maximum duration, a maximum number of connections per session, per authorized session, and a default port, which in this case is 22. I'm going to make a new target, but first I actually want to show one other thing related to this existing command, which is something that we call styles. So I'm going to use style putty. And we realize that basically, people have different ideas of their kind of preferred client for how they want to connect to any given application, right? So, I might want to use SSH command line, other people might want to use putty. And by having these styles, what we can do is we can invoke things that are not sort of a single default. And by using something like that username flag, so I'm connecting in through putty here, but that username flag will basically mean that we're actually going to pass that username in the correct way, regardless of which client you're actually using. So, Boundary Connect there, it's a really powerful command. If I just run Boundary Connect and give it a target ID, let's see what happens. So when I just run Boundary Connect, what happens is it's opening up a listening port and on an interface. And that interface is actually controllable. The port, if you want, you can hard code it to something. Ideally, you won't do that because it's more secure not to. But that is basically opening this listening socket through which you can make an authenticated session. So when we ran Boundary Connect, it went to the controller. It said, can I please make this session? Can you please authorize me? And when the controller said yes, then it gave back the authorization information necessary for the client to make that connection. And this is really, really flexible. We can do this exec command for connect. And this is going to be the same thing as me doing Boundary Connect SSH, but Boundary Connect SSH is just kind of a special case of running this exec command. So if you do exec, then anything that you pass after those double dashes will actually get sent to the command that's being execed. And we can template in some things. So you can see I'm using a login name of Jeff and a port of boundary.port. And that didn't work because it's actually not boundary.host, it's boundary.ip. I apologize for that. So there's boundary.ip and boundary.adder, which sort of has both. And you can see here, I'm connected in through Boundary again, but it said, do you want to connect to this about the, can't verify the authenticity of the host. When you use Boundary Connect SSH, part of the kinds of things we can do is we can set a host key alias to make it transparent so that you don't actually need to have that every single time that you connect, have it be a new host that you have to authorize. So, so having that sort of, those subcommands to Boundary Connect lets us really make your life pretty easy in terms of making those connections. So I'm going to go back to the UI. I'm going to make a new target for Postgres. I'm going to set the maximum duration to 15 seconds. I'm going to use -1. Postgres needs more than one connection to authenticate, so I'm just going to set it to -1, which is unlimited. And I used the port that I copied at the very beginning of the demo from the container that was set up by Boundary Dev. I need to add the host set, which has the local host as a part of it, to the target. And now I'm going to write, I copied the target ID. I'm going to run Boundary Connect Postgres, give it that target ID, give it a username. Again, same thing. We can, if there's different styles we support, we can pass in the username where it makes sense. And now I'm connected to Postgres. And you can see I can do a describe table, and I can see the tables that are there. And I'm going to hold on just a moment. We're going to see if you remember I set that session maximum lifetime to 15 seconds. If you look on the right, in a couple of seconds, we'll see it. There it goes. So it's closed. And now I can't connect anymore. And attempting to reconnect will fail because that session is done. I can no longer make connections through that session anymore. I would have to reauthorize, go back to the controller and ask for permission again to make more connections through that target. So, there's through that kind of combination of time-based and connection count-based, pretty powerful. So now I'm going to show some of the Terraform language. Everything within Boundary can be described through Terraform, all the resources. So this has an auth method and an account and a user for Pete. Pete's not going to use it for what he's going to show you, but this is just to kind of show some of the completeness in terms of the UI and Terraform. And so there's some roles and some hosts and some host sets and some targets. So I'm going to apply this, and then we'll take a look at it within the UI to see what that looks like. So you can probably imagine if you're already using Terraform to describe all of your infrastructure, all of your state, it's pretty easy to get all of that into Boundary in a way that makes sense. So now I'm in the org scope. I created this auth method. You can see there was one account called Pete. I created a user for Pete Pacent, one account that's linked to that account ID. And I set up a role which has just Pete, just that user as its lone principal, and a single grant, which is very tightly scoped. So it's for that initial generated target. It gives read and authorized session permissions. Boundary it's zero trust. It's default deny. There's no deny capability. You can only add. And so you start out with the ability to do nothing, and you have to explicitly grant what you want access to. But it also means that going in and generating this wide swath and hoping that you've then locked down enough permissions is something that you don't need to worry about. And then in this host catalog, we've now generated some hosts. We see Google and Syrup, named for the way that my then 3-year-old daughter would pronounce maple syrup. And this host has www.google.com, and we're going to see what that looks like in a bit. And I created 2 host sets to hold those. And along with that, I created 2 targets. So one is called RDP, and we can see I set the maximum connections. I think RDP takes 2, but I was being lazy and I set it to -1. You would probably not want to do that in a real production environment. And a default port of 3389, which is the RDP default port. And I created one other target, which is HTTP to Googs, and a default port of 443. So I'm going to show what these look like. So I'm going to do boundary connect RDP. You can probably imagine what's going to happen. Give it that target ID. And it's launching the remote desktop client. And that's my laptop. So I'm now RDP'd into my laptop through Boundary. And then the next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to run a Boundary Connect HTTP call. Got to go copy that target ID. And this is actually going to fail. And the reason this is going to fail is that when I connect to localhost, if I, in the absence of anything else, it'll look for a certificate that has an IP SAN, a subject alternative name of 127.0.0.1. So this is kind of one of those nice things that we can do for you if you use these subcommands is if you just pass in host and you give it the host to expect, we'll pop that host into the SNI header for TLS. And you can see that when we do that, we're actually able to successfully fetch Google's homepage through Boundary. And I mean, you can do all sorts of fun with this. You can have authenticated calls to make DNS connections through DIG to public servers if you really want to. So it's a pretty flexible system, especially using Boundary Connect with exec and just building up your own sort of set of commands. So everything that you've seen in the UI in Terraform, we have a very full-featured CLI. It supports auto-completion everywhere. It supports flags for every single value, so that every flag can be auto-completed. And you can see there I did a targets list and a target read on a particular ID. So everything that you see there is fully instrumented throughout the CLI and Terraform and the UI as well. Hopefully this has been a really good introduction to what Boundary can do. And I'm going to pass it back to Pete to show you some of the intelligence around it.
Thanks very much, Jeff. So next, I'd like to quickly show you how Boundary gives you visibility into the sessions that end users create. So here, I'm also locally hosting a Boundary cluster, but this time, there's many users on our team that have used this cluster to access targets and create sessions. Now, while I can view a log of access data from those created sessions in Boundary's administrator UI, the Boundary cluster itself maintains a Postgres database that can serve this data so that you can analyze it as you see fit and even integrate it with your BI or security information event tool of choice. Now, here I've actually created an example dashboard in Power BI that shows how easy it is to customize this data to fit your needs. Now, in this dashboard, I can view the number of targets and users managed by this Boundary cluster, as well as the total number of sessions that have been created and the number of currently active sessions. I can also see that one of my targets, in this case, my target for my application's Postgres instances, actually has a high number of active sessions. When I drill in, I can also see that one of my users, in this case Pete, has created an abnormally high number of sessions, and that these sessions are all created in a short time span. Now, In the real world, this very well might indicate a potential security threat, in which case I could use Boundary's ability to revoke my role membership for that suspicious user, or even terminate those sessions in real time, as Jeff just demonstrated. Now, this is really just one example of how to customize this data with Boundary. Given Boundary's open design, we're really just scratching the surface of your ability to define custom workflows for threat monitoring and management with Boundary. Now, hopefully this demo gives a little bit more context in terms of how Boundary is going to enable granular identity-based access controls, access automation, and session monitoring. But to close, I'd like to talk a little bit more about where Boundary goes from here. Now, in our releases following launch, we'll be focused on building out the pillars of Boundary's ephemeral model of access. First, by focusing on enabling users to integrate their organization's identity provider of choice with Boundary, so that Boundary's identity-based controls reflect the same identities that users have for their other applications. Additionally, we'll focus on integration with Vault or your preferred credential management solution of choice, so that you can use ephemeral credentials minted by Vault to authenticate to Boundary targets. This would enable a single sign-on flow so that those creds are obscured from the actual end users of Boundary. And lastly, we'll further streamline this access model by enabling administrators to define dynamic catalogs of hosts even outside of Terraform, so that services can be discovered based on predefined rules or tags on their environment of choice. Now with that, we'd really just love to invite you to try out Boundary for yourselves. Boundary is now available to try out at boundaryproject.io, and we've got a whole set of onboarding docs and tutorials to make it easier to onboard and really deep dive into the concepts and content of what Boundary is about. With that though, really appreciate you taking the time to learn a little bit more about Boundary, and looking forward to working with you to build this product out going forward.